Welcome to No Name, the home of true-to-life RV camping horrors, unsettling encounters in the deep American wilderness, and stories that remind us why the woods are never as empty as they seem. Tonight's story is one more reason to always trust your instincts and never assume you're alone at a campground. If you enjoyed diving into the strange, the eerie, and the unexplainable, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and share your own camping experiences in the comments. Your story might be the next one we bring to life. Now, settle in, turn up the volume, and let's step into the dark together. I've learned that some roads look empty until you finally admit you've been on them too long. And on a cold October night outside Boone, North Carolina, I realized an empty road can watch you the way a person does. My name is Evan, I'm 34, and I've spent most of my adult life trying to reclaim the peace that camping used to give me as a kid. My wife, Leah, is the opposite. Steady, logical, quick to dismiss any nagging discomfort. Together, we've logged thousands of miles in our RV across the southeastern U.S., chasing quiet nights, mountain air, and the kind of stillness that city life can't manufacture. But October of 2022, that was the trip that nearly took all of that from me. We'd driven up the Blue Ridge Parkway earlier that week, the leaves fire-colored and falling, the mountains wrapped in a cold haze that looked soft from a distance, but sharp when you were inside it. Our plan was simple. 2 nights at a small private campground just outside Boone, a place with good reviews, full hookups, and supposedly a view that made you feel like the mountains kept you. A place we'd been told was peaceful, almost too quiet. Even now, the phrase too quiet rattles around in my memory like a loose bolt. What I remember most about that drive is how tired I felt. Not physically, emotionally. That year had worn me down. My father had passed in spring after a long decline. And even though we hadn't been close, grief has a way of sticking its hands into places you thought were sealed shut. I'd started waking up tense, feeling watched even when I was alone. My therapist told me it was anxiety, that the mind looks for danger after loss, like a spotlight sweeping the dark. I thought getting back out into the mountains would help me reset. I thought silence would help me breathe again. But sometimes silence isn't the healer you want it to be. We pulled into the campground an hour before sunset. Only 4 or 5 rigs were there, scattered widely across the property, as if the owners wanted everyone to feel like they were in their own little pocket of woods. Our spot sat near a narrow trail, the map labeled Hollow Road Access Path, a footpath leading to a dirt service road older than the campground itself. We didn't think anything of it. If anything, I liked the idea of exploring it the next morning. Night came quicker than we expected. A cold wind pushed through the trees, and the campground lights flickered once or twice as if the wiring didn't appreciate the season changing. We grilled dinner, talked about nothing, tried to find comfort in the darkness around us. But there was something off about that first night. Something in the air, something that felt like we'd arrived somewhere we weren't supposed to stay long. It started with the sound. A soft, dragging noise from the tree line. Not quite footsteps, not quite an animal either. Something steady, something deliberate. I paused mid-sentence, fork in hand. "You hear that?" I asked. Leah listened for a moment, then shrugged. "Probably a deer." But it wasn't the way deer moved. I grew up near Pisgah National Forest. I know what deer sound like, their anxious, uneven scamper, the sudden stillness when they sense you. This sound was slower, more patient, like something pacing itself. 10 minutes later, it was gone, and I told myself to stop making shapes out of shadows. We turned in early, the wind tapping the branches against the roof with an irregular rhythm. Scrape, pause, scrape, scrape, pause, as if trying to sync with my heartbeat. Around midnight, I woke to use the bathroom, the kind of half-sleep stumble where your instincts should be soft and unfocused. But mine weren't. Something felt wrong the moment I opened my eyes. Heavy. Pressured. As if the air had changed, grown thicker. I paused at the window beside the kitchenette, looking out toward the access path. Everything was black, but not the normal kind of nighttime black, the kind that swallows outlines, details, distance, a full, impenetrable dark. Then my eyes snagged on something, a shape. Standing still near the tree line, facing the RV. I didn't move. I wasn't even sure I breathed. It was tall, human-shaped, but the darkness hid every feature. Just the silhouette, just the undeniable outline of someone standing too close, too still, on a cold mountain night with no logical reason to be there. I blinked hard, leaned closer to the glass, trying to force my tired brain into rationality. Maybe it was a stump, a shadow, something tricking my depth perception. But the longer I stared, the more certain I became. There was a head, shoulders, the faint suggestion of arms at the sides. And there was something unnatural about the posture. Upright, stiff, like someone bracing against the cold without actually reacting to it. Then came the strangest part. The moment I tried to focus on its legs, on the way it connected to the ground, my eyes slid away, not by choice, as if something deep in my brain refused to look directly at it. I don't know how long I stood there. Eventually I whispered, "Leah?" She stirred but didn't wake fully. "What is it?" she asked groggily. "There's someone outside." That got her up. She slid out of the covers and joined me at the window, squinting into the darkness. "I don't see anything," she said. I swallowed, hard. The figure was gone. I didn't know whether I felt relieved or terrified. We checked the locks, door, windows, even the storage compartment latches. Everything was secure. Everything was how it should be. And yet my skin felt electric with wrongness, like my nerves were listening to a frequency the rest of my mind couldn't hear. Leah eventually fell back asleep. I didn't. Hours later, when the sun pushed pale light through the blinds, I stepped outside. Frost dusted the grass, breath hovered in the air, and on the ground near the access path, I found it. A single shoe print. Not a boot, not a hiking tread. A flat-soled shoe, the kind people wear in town, not in the mountains. Deep enough to be fresh. Pointed directly at our RV, but only one. Just one. As if the person had stood there, unmoving, watching. I told myself it wasn't enough to panic over. Maybe someone from another campsite wandered, confused. Maybe a maintenance guy took the wrong path. Maybe my eyes played tricks at night. We had a whole day ahead. Waterfalls to see. A farmer's market in Boonlea wanted to visit. A lunch spot we'd bookmarked. But the whole day, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had started the night before. Something subtle, something quiet. And I didn't know how to talk about it without sounding unstable. Especially now, after months of anxiety, loss, and therapy sessions, where I tried convincing myself that fear was just an echo, not an omen. We returned to the campground close to dusk, and as we backed into our spot, a strange discomfort settled in my chest. Like the RV wasn't returning to camp, but to a waiting place, something holding its breath for us. Leah went inside to start dinner. I stayed outside to check the utilities, trying to be normal, trying to keep my hands from trembling, and that's when I heard it again. That dragging sound. Slow, rhythmic, like something moving along the ground just beyond sight. I turned toward the access path. The light was fading. The trees formed a dark archway over the trail, and through it, maybe 20 feet in, I saw movement. A person standing half hidden in the shadowed corridor of branches. Facing me, I froze. They weren't walking, weren't approaching, just standing there like the night before. But now, in the remaining sliver of daylight, I could see something I hadn't noticed earlier. Their head wasn't level. It was slightly tilted, as if they were studying me. And I realized with a coldness I can still feel today, they weren't lost, they weren't confused. They were waiting. Waiting for me to notice them, waiting for me to react. Before I could call out, before I could even breathe, the figure turned, slowly, purposefully, and disappeared deeper into the trees, down Hollow Road. Not running, not stumbling, just quietly retreating, like an invitation. That's where everything truly began. I didn't follow the figure into the trees. I wasn't that reckless, and honestly, fear pinned my feet to the earth harder than any rational caution. I stood there in the thinning light, trying to breathe through the tightness in my chest, trying to convince myself I hadn't seen what I knew I'd seen. When I finally managed to move, I backed slowly toward the RV door, eyes locked on the shadowed trail as if turning away would give the figure permission to come back. I slipped inside and locked the door, forcing a casual tone as I said, "Someone's walking near the path again." Leah looked up from the stove, tongs in hand. "Again? Evan, you didn't even see a person last night?" "I saw him," I said quietly, "clear as day." "What did he look like?" I opened my mouth and nothing came. Not because I didn't remember, but because there was nothing to describe. A shape, a silhouette, no details, no face. It was like trying to describe a dream the moment after waking, real but impossible to hold. "It was a man," I said finally, "tall, wearing something dark, just standing there." She stared at me, reading me, weighing my words against my history of anxiety. Maybe it's just someone walking to the service road. You know, some people like wandering around at dusk. "Not like this," I said quietly. He wasn't walking anywhere. He was waiting. The skepticism in her eyes wasn't harsh. It was the same look she gave me when I lost my words in grief group. Concern, not disbelief. But concern feels like disbelief when you're convinced you've seen something dangerous. Dinner tasted like nothing. The lights inside felt too bright. Every window felt like a pair of eyes. Around 9, a knock came at the RV door, sharp and unexpected. I nearly jumped out of my skin. Leah put a hand on my arm as she went to open it. A man in a reflective vest stood outside holding a clipboard. "Evening, folks," he said. "Sorry to bother y'all. Just doing a quick check-in." One of the campers reported seeing someone walking the service road who didn't seem like they belonged. My stomach dropped. "Did you see anyone unusual?" he asked. I hesitated. Leah didn't. "No," she said. "We've been inside." He nodded and scribbled something on his paper. "If you see anyone lingering around your site, just give the front office a call. We've had some trespass issues this week." "Like what?" I asked. He gave a little shrug, the kind people use when they're downplaying something. Local hikers using the back road without permission. Sometimes the occasional squatter. Nothing to be too concerned about. But his eyes flicked toward the trees when he said it. A quick, instinctive glance. I thanked him, though it didn't feel like gratitude fit the moment. When he left, Leah locked the door again. Her tone softened. "Okay, maybe someone is wandering around, but it doesn't mean they're interested in us." I didn't argue. Some part of me wanted her to be right, wanted a logical explanation so badly I almost let myself believe it. We played cards for a while, letting the click of shuffling break the silence. But around 10:30, something shifted in the air again. The wind died. The RV creaked. The kind of stillness came that doesn't feel like peace, but like a room holding its breath. And then the dragging sound started again. Slow, deliberate, coming from the side of the RV facing the trees. I stood. "Do you hear that?" She froze mid-card draw, her head tilted. Her eyes narrowed. This time she heard it. We both moved toward the window silently. She lifted the corner of the curtain an inch. Her breath hitched. "What?" I whispered. She let go of the curtain. "Someone's out there." That should have validated me. Should have helped. But instead, dread tightened around my ribs like a belt. "What are they doing?" I asked. "I don't know. They're just standing there, facing the RV." My skin went cold. "Should we call the office?" "Yeah, do it." I grabbed my phone, but the moment I unlocked it, the dragging sound stopped, and then came a soft, barely there knock on the RV's exterior wall. Not the door, the side, right below the window. A knock meant for no one, too soft, too slow. A knock not asking to be answered, just announcing presence. Leah clapped her hand over her mouth to keep from making a sound. I stepped back, throat tight, feeling something irrational coil inside me. Something primal, something old. My father once told me that real fear doesn't come from something chasing you. Real fear comes from the moment you realize something has already arrived. We waited, barely breathing. A minute passed, then 2, then 5. Nothing. Finally, Leah whispered, "I think he's gone." But the air still felt wrong, heavy, expectant. I went to the door, peering through the tiny built-in window. The porch light cast its limited glow over the gravel pad. Nothing moved. I exhaled. Maybe it really was someone confused. A lost hiker. A strung-out local, someone looking for help but too out of it to knock properly. But I didn't believe that. We decided to sleep with all blinds closed, phones charged, keys ready. I didn't fall asleep easily. My mind kept drawing the figure in the doorway of my thoughts, replaying that tilt of the head, that deliberate stillness, the way they'd retreated deeper into the woods like they expected me to follow. Sometime after midnight, I drifted off, exhaustion pulling me under despite the fear. Then a metallic rattle snapped me awake. I sat straight up. The propane compartment latch, right outside near the access path side, was shaking, like someone was pulling on it, testing it. I grabbed Leah, shaking her awake. She blinked in confusion, then alarm as she heard it too. A faint metallic tick, then another, like fingers tapping the latch. Testing, feeling. "Call the office," I whispered. She nodded, grabbing her phone, but before she could dial, the rattle stopped. Silence. Long. Dense. Then footsteps, soft, moving slowly along the side of the RV. They paused at our bedroom window. I didn't breathe. Then another knock. Not on the wall this time. On the glass. A tiny, controlled tap. Almost polite. Leah's hand flew to her mouth again. I couldn't move. My mind screamed to shout, to turn on lights, to do something, but my body refused. I felt trapped behind my own skin, like any motion would make whatever was out there more real. The tap came again. One. Then after a beat, another. A rhythm, not random, measured. Then footsteps again. Slow. Moving away this time. We waited at least 10 minutes before either of us moved. Leah's voice shook. "I'm calling the office now," but when she dialed, there was no service. Not one bar. Earlier that night, we'd had full signal. She tried again. Nothing. "We should leave," she whispered. "Right now." I nodded. I started throwing on clothes. She grabbed her backpack. Adrenaline made everything fast, sharp, vivid. Fight or flight, but without the fight. I stepped to the front, starting the engine. The dashboard lights glowed. The RV hummed. I unlocked the wheel. "Check if the hitch is clear," she said. "Make sure nothing's behind us." I grabbed the flashlight, cracked the door open, and stepped into the cold night. The air smelled wrong, like wet soil turned over, like something freshly disturbed. I swept the beam across the gravel. Something glittered near the propane hatch. I moved closer. A handprint. In the condensation. Clear. Perfect. Pressed onto the metal surface like someone had leaned their palm there. Not smeared. Not rushed. Placed. And underneath the print, below the latch, the gravel was disturbed. A single footprint. Again, just one. But this time it faced away from the RV, like someone had stood there watching, then walked off into the trees. I turned to the trail. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, landing on the hollow road path. And in the center of that beam, the same figure, standing there. Still. Silent. This time closer. Close enough that I felt it. Not visually, but physically. Like pressure. Like focus. My breath rattled out of me. My hands shook so hard the light wobbled. The figure didn't move. It didn't react to the light. It just watched. And then, slowly, its head tilted again, that same unnatural angle. Studying me, as if comparing who I was now to who I had been last night. Something inside me cracked. Fear, grief, exhaustion blending into a single sharp impulse. I backed toward the RV door, eyes locked on the figure the entire time. "Leah," I whispered, voice breaking, "we have to go, now." She opened the door, I stumbled inside, slammed it shut, through the locks. The figure didn't move, but I knew, with absolute clarity, it wasn't finished. The moment the locks clicked into place, I felt the RV shrink around us like the walls tightened, the air thinned, the night pressed in from all sides. Leah was pacing, hands shaking as she gathered anything loose on the counters. "Go," she whispered. "Just drive. I don't care if we leave the blocks. Just get us out of here." She didn't have to say it twice. I climbed into the driver's seat, turned the ignition, and prayed the engine wouldn't stall from the cold. The RV rumbled awake. For a second, everything looked almost normal, the dashboard glowing its soft green, the backup camera flickering on, the headlights washing the gravel in pale gold. But the figure was still there, in the exact same place. Still angled toward the RV, head tilted. I could feel him through the windshield before I even looked. A pressure, a weight. As if staring wasn't enough, He wanted to be felt. Leah hovered behind my seat. Don't look at him, just reverse. But I couldn't help it. My eyes flicked toward the trail. The figure was closer than before. Not a lot. Maybe 2 feet, maybe 3. But enough to know he'd moved. Quietly, intentionally, without hesitation. A cold realization sank into me. He wasn't lost. He wasn't wandering. He was approaching slowly, deliberately, testing how close he could get before I broke. I dropped the RV into reverse. The tires crunched over the gravel. The hitch groaned. We backed out of the sight, the headlights cutting across the row of empty spots like a spotlight sweeping a stage. Leah watched the monitor. Clear, clear, keep going. Then she gasped. What? I snapped. He's moving. I looked up at the monitor just in time to see the figure step out from the edge of the trail onto the gravel pad. Still slow, still steady, but undeniably in our direction. He wasn't running, wasn't hiding, just walking. Straight toward the back of the RV. A sensation rushed through me, something beyond fear. Something like violation. Like he had decided we were already his property, and there was no need to hurry. I floored it harder than I meant to, the RV lurching as we reversed onto the main loop road. I swung the wheel, put it in drive, and pressed the accelerator. The headlights carved a path ahead, bouncing over the uneven ground. That's enough, Leah said, voice cracking. That's enough. He's too close. I didn't need convincing. I didn't want to see him again. But the campground roads felt longer than they had when we arrived, twisting through dark pines that swallowed the light. Every turn felt like it might reveal him standing in the middle of the lane, head tilted, waiting. Signal's still gone, Leah said, staring at her phone. 0 bars. We'll call as soon as we hit the highway. The exit lane approached, a narrow 1-lane gravel strip leading to a wooden gate. As we drew closer, I felt my stomach tighten. The gate was closed. It shouldn't have been closed. Campgrounds don't lock people in at night. Ever. Not unless something has gone badly wrong. Leah leaned forward, whispering, "Why is it shut? Evan, why is it shut?" There was a keypad on the side post, 4 buttons, worn from years of use. A sign read, "Enter code for after-hours exit." But we'd never been given a code. My pulse hammered in my throat. "Try calling them again," I said. "Try anyone." She tried. Nothing. Not even the attempting to connect symbol, like the night itself swallowed the signal. I threw the RV into park, heart pounding. There has to be something posted, a default code, a call number. I grabbed the flashlight and stepped toward the gate. Cold hit me instantly, sharp enough to make my eyes water. The woods to my left and right were silent, not the natural kind of silence, but the hollow kind. A silence that listens. I scanned the wooden post. No code, no instructions, no emergency release, nothing. Leah cracked the window an inch. "Hurry, please." I stepped back, shining the beam along the ground instinctively, and froze. A single footprint in the dust, fresh, clear, right behind the RV, and beside it another, not spaced like walking, closer together. I lifted the flashlight higher, a 3rd print, then a 4th, leading from the tree line straight toward the RV, stopping right at the rear bumper. He'd closed the distance faster than he ever moved when we were watching him. He'd been almost on us. My voice broke. "We can't stay here." "Then break the gate." I stared at it. Wooden, old, reinforced with a steel crossbeam. Maybe the RV could push through. Maybe it would wreck the bumper. Maybe it didn't matter. Then something moved in the corner of my vision. I turned. The forest on the right side of the exit road, dark, thick, silent, shifted. Just a tiny flicker of motion. A suggestion of a darker shape within the dark. I steadied the flashlight, breath catching. There he was, half hidden behind a tree, closer than before, still, tilting his head just slightly as though curious how I might try to leave. I felt something unravel inside me, something that tethered me to the idea of safety, reason, common sense. I didn't think, didn't breathe. I just ran back to the RV and slammed the door behind me. "Drive through it," Leah said, hand shaking on the dashboard. "Do it now." I floored it. The RV barreled forward, headlights smashing into the wooden gate. The old boards buckled, cracked, and finally split with a violent groan. The steel beam scraped the bumper, tearing a long, angry screech into the night as the gate swung outward and crashed to the side. We didn't stop to check damage. We didn't look back. The RV surged onto the gravel road beyond the gate, then to the county road, then to the highway. Only when we hit Route 421 and cell service flickered back to life did I finally inhale fully, like my lungs had been seized until that moment. Leah dialed 911 immediately. "What's your emergency?" the dispatcher asked. Leah tried to explain, but the words came out tangled. "A person following, watching us, tried to get into the RV." I took the phone. "Someone was stalking our campsite," I said, voice steadier than I felt. "They approached the RV multiple times. They followed us to the exit. We need someone to check the campground." The dispatcher's tone shifted, tightening. "Where are you now?" I gave the highway markers. She told us to pull into the next gas station for safety. She said she'd notify Watauga County deputies to check the grounds. But before we hung up, she asked one more question. "Did the person ever speak to you? Make any verbal threats?" I paused. "No," I said. "They never spoke." Silence on her end. Then, "Okay, officers will be dispatched." When we reached the gas station, a bright oasis of fluorescent light, I felt my whole body tremble, adrenaline draining like water through a broken dam. Leah cried for the first time that night, the kind of trembling tears that come after your mind catches up with what happened. We waited nearly an hour before a deputy called us back. His voice was calm, polite, practiced. "We checked the campground," he said, "walked the trails, the service road, checked for trespassers." "And?" I asked. "No one out there." My grip tightened on the phone. "There were footprints," I said, "a handprint on the propane hatch. Someone was there." "We didn't see any prints. It rained lightly after you left, enough to wash away surface marks." A pause. "Sir, are you absolutely sure someone was outside your RV?" I closed my eyes. I saw the silhouette, the tilt of the head, the footprints, the handprint, the tapping on the window, the footsteps circling the RV. "Yes," I said, "I'm sure." The deputy exhaled slowly. Not disbelief. Something else. Something like reluctant agreement. "You're not the first to report a figure around that old service road," he said quietly. "But we've never caught anyone." Leah watched me, waiting for whatever the deputy would say next. He lowered his voice. "Just don't go back there. People disappear in those woods every few years. Always hikers. Always near that same old road. We don't know who it is or what their deal is, but they don't want to be seen." I swallowed hard. "Do they ever try to get into vehicles? Into RVs?" Another long pause. "Only once," he said. "October 2018. Couple reported someone tapping on their trailer windows. They left fast. Same general area, same time of year." "What happened to them?" I asked. "They moved away, left the state, never camped again." When I hung up, the weight of the night settled fully. Leah slid into my arms, and I held her, trying to steady my breathing. The deputy's final words circled my mind like a dark current. They don't want to be seen, but he wasn't hiding. He wanted me to see him. He wanted me to notice. He wanted me to know he was there. And I can't shake the feeling that if I had opened the door, if I had stepped toward him, if I had followed that silent road deeper into the trees, I wouldn't be here to tell this story. I've always believed that fear rarely announces itself with a scream. More often, it comes disguised as a whisper, something small, something almost ignorable, until the whisper becomes the only sound you hear. That belief didn't come from books or movies. It came from one night in September of 2021, tucked deep inside the towering pines of Acadia National Park, when I learned what it meant to feel watched by something I couldn't see, something I couldn't explain, something I still can't fully understand. My name is Evan Caro, 43 years old at the time, born and raised in Western Massachusetts, though I spent more nights in national forests than in my own backyard. I'm not a thrill seeker, not some adrenaline-chasing nomad. I camp to breathe, to quiet myself, to feel something real. For years, my RV, a boxy old Volkswagen Westfalia I rebuilt bolt by bolt, was my escape hatch from everything I couldn't fix about my life. Acadia had always been my sanctuary. Sharp cliffs, cold wind rolling off the Atlantic. Trails that wound like veins through dense pine stands. But that September, something about the park felt different. The air had an unsettled edge to it, thicker, heavier, as if the forest were holding its breath and waiting for someone to notice. I arrived at the campground just before sunset, the sky turning a soft orange that made the treetops look like they were burning silently. The place wasn't crowded, a few scattered RVs, a handful of tents, enough people to feel like civilization was nearby, but not close enough to stop the loneliness from settling over everything. It was a kind of loneliness I usually welcomed, but that evening, it felt pointed, like it was aimed at me. I chose a site near the edge of the loop, close to a narrow trail that twisted deeper into the woods. When I stepped out of my RV, the first thing I noticed was the smell, stronger than the usual pine, sharper, colder. A smell like wet bark and metal. It pulled at something instinctual inside me, something I dismissed as exhaustion from the drive. But the longer I stood there, the more I felt it. A faint pressure, like air thickening around my neck. Not painful, just present and wrong. I shrugged it off. You learn to ignore odd sensations in the woods, or you'll never camp again. The first real sign that something was off came not long after I started making dinner. I had just set a pot on the stove when I heard a soft crunch behind me, leaves underfoot, branches shifting. Not unusual in a place full of tourists, but this was close, too close. I turned, expecting to see a hiker wandering through. Nothing. Just the wall of trees, dense and darkening with the fading light. But the feeling, someone standing just out of sight, lingered long enough to make the hairs on my arms rise. I scanned the underbrush, slowed my breathing, listened. Silence. The kind of silence that feels intentional. I forced myself to laugh quietly. "Relax, Evan," I muttered. "It's Acadia, not a crime scene." But even as I said it, I didn't believe it. After dinner, I walked the short trail behind my campsite to settle my nerves. The pines stretched tall above me, their needles whispering in the wind. The deeper I went, the colder the air felt, not like natural dip in temperature cold, but a localized chill that moved with me, trailed me. Each step made a soft thud against the packed soil, but every few dozen steps I heard something else. A lighter footstep. Careful. Deliberate. Echoing mine a beat too late. I stopped. The echo didn't. It kept going, one more slow step, then stillness. I turned around fast. Again, nothing. No hiker, no animal, no branches swaying. Just the void between the trees growing darker with each breath. My throat tightened. My instincts screamed that I wasn't alone anymore. But rationality, the thing that too often makes fools of experienced campers, won the argument. It's a deer, I told myself. A fox. Something curious. Something explainable. I headed back faster than I intended. When I reached my RV, the campsite felt different, like something had walked through while I was gone. The air smelled damp, heavy, almost spoiled, like overturned earth after rainfall. I shivered, rubbed my arms, and went inside. I thought closing the door would help. It didn't. The windows rattled gently in the wind, but underneath it, I heard something else. Soft, rhythmic taps. Not like branches scraping, not like pine cones falling. Taps with a pattern. 3. Pause. 3 again. Knuckles against glass. I froze. The tapping stopped. The rational part of me kicked in again. Branches, I told myself. It's always branches. But I'd parked away from overhanging limbs deliberately, and the taps were too evenly spaced, too intentional. I waited, breath held so tight it hurt. Then it came again. Tap, tap, tap. This time, closer. Lower on the window. Someone crouching? Every instinct screamed, go look, but another part of me, the older part, the primal part, told me not to move, not to shift the weight of the RV, not to make a sound. After several long minutes, the tapping stopped. I stayed still until the wind changed direction and the quiet settled into something almost peaceful. But I didn't sleep. I laid in the small bunk, staring at the ceiling, listening for anything familiar, anything normal. What I heard instead was breathing. Not mine. It was faint at first, coming from just outside the driver's side window. Slow, steady, human. as if someone were leaning against the glass, listening to me breathe in return. I stayed dead still. The breathing grew sharper, closer to the window. Then I heard something drag, not a hand, not a full body, just fingertips, across the metal siding of my RV. Slow. Deliberate. Almost curious. I felt sweat gather under my shirt, even though the air was cold. Every muscle tensed as the sound moved from the driver's window to the sliding door, fingertips tracing a path like someone mapping the shape of my home. The dragging stopped just beneath the small kitchen window. Then silence. Long, suffocating silence. I counted breaths. Mine, not theirs. 1, 2, 3. Then the sound returned, but not as dragging, as footsteps, soft, careful, circling the RV. Whoever, or whatever it was, they were close. Close enough to touch the door handle if they wanted. I reached slowly, silently for the hammer I kept under the passenger seat. The metal was cold against my palm. I gripped it so hard my hand cramped. The footsteps stopped on the far side of the RV near the small trail that led into the woods. And then I heard it. A quiet exhale. Not the wind. Human. Controlled. Followed by a low whisper, too soft to understand the words, but unmistakably directed toward me. A whisper with no tremble, no uncertainty. Calm. Watching. My heart hammered in my chest, loud enough I was terrified it could be heard outside. I stayed frozen, locked in that moment, knowing one wrong sound could invite something I wasn't ready to confront. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. Time felt thin. Finally, the whispering ceased. Footsteps retreated. Leaves shifted. Then, nothing, just the far-off pulse of the ocean. I stayed awake until dawn, but morning didn't bring relief. When I stepped outside, the first thing I saw was the ground beside my RV, soft soil marked by footprints. Not boots. Not hiking shoes. Bare feet. Small. Narrow. Too narrow for a grown adult, but too large for a child. The prints circled the RV once, then vanished into the tree line. My stomach twisted. My hands trembled. The night had been real. As I stood there staring, a voice behind me broke the silence. "You saw it too? Didn't you?" I turned. A woman stood near the next campsite over, pale eyes sunken from lack of sleep. She looked exactly how I felt. Unsettled, shaken, terrified to name the thing stalking the woods. Before I could answer, she stepped closer and lowered her voice. "They always come back the second night." Her words clung to the cold morning air like frost. "They always come back the second night." I stared at her, waiting for some hint she was joking, exaggerating, teasing a newcomer. But her expression stayed locked, tight, fearful, drained of any color. She looked like someone who had already lived through the night I barely survived. "Who?" I asked softly, because raising my voice felt wrong here. Like the pines were listening. She hesitated, then glanced toward the tree line as if something might be watching even in daylight. "I don't know," she whispered. "I've never seen its face, but I've been hearing it for 2 nights now. The breathing, the scratching, the footsteps around the tent." She swallowed hard. "It's not an animal." A part of me wanted to dismiss her, tell her we were both tired, imagining things, letting fear shape shadows into something human. But the footprints, the tapping, the whisper, my voice cracked. "What does it want?" Another silence. Then, "I think it just watches. I think that's all it's ever doing." A strange wave of nausea hit me, not from disgust, but from recognition. That same feeling from last night, the sense of being studied like a specimen, flooded back. Before I could say anything, a ranger truck rolled down the loop, tires crunching over gravel. The woman stepped back instantly, her shoulders tightening as if bracing for interrogation. Ranger patrols are normal in Acadia, but this ranger didn't have the usual relaxed posture. He scanned each campsite with an intensity that struck me immediately. Not protective, but anxious. He slowed when he saw us standing near the footprints. His gaze dropped, lingered, and his jaw tightened. "Morning," he said with deliberate calm. "Everything all right here?" His tone said he already knew the answer. I pointed at the prints. "Do you get barefoot hikers out here?" He didn't even look up. Sometimes. The lie was obvious. Too quick. Too practiced. "These aren't small enough for a child," the woman said, her voice shaking. "And they came right up to my tent. Twice. The ranger stepped closer, blocking her view of the ground like he didn't want her to keep staring or thinking. Footprints can be misleading, he said. Soil shifts, rain distorts, people misjudge sizes. It didn't rain last night, I cut in. The ranger paused. A short, difficult pause, the kind where the truth tries to slip out before being shoved down again. He inhaled long and steady as if he were about to recite something memorized. Listen, both of you. If you heard anything strange last night, it was likely just wildlife. Acadia has foxes, coyotes, owls. None of those knock on glass, I said. Now he looked at me directly. His eyes were tired, haunted in a way that people usually hide. Just stay close to your campsite today. Don't wander alone. He swallowed. And don't go out after dark. He returned to his truck before either of us could ask more. As he drove off, the woman let out a shaky breath. You see, she whispered. They know. They've known. That's why they patrol this loop so much. I didn't want to believe her. But the ranger's expression, the kind that only forms when someone's hiding something heavy, stuck with me. After we parted ways, I spent the rest of the morning trying to shake the unease. I hiked a popular trail near the coast, forcing myself into daylight, believing movement would clear my head. It didn't. Every time the wind shifted the branches, I jumped. Every snap of a stick sent a shock through my chest. Fear makes the familiar hostile. By the time I returned to camp that afternoon, the sky had turned a dull, muted gray, clouds thick enough to smother the sun. Evening would come sooner tonight. Shadows would stretch longer. I tried to convince myself to leave. I even sat in the driver's seat with the keys in my hand, staring at the road that led back toward town. But something held me there. Not stubbornness, not arrogance, something deeper. A quiet intuition that if I left now, whatever shadow I encountered last night would follow me forever, hiding in the corners of my memory, growing larger each year. I needed to understand what was happening, or I'd never escape it. I stayed because fear demands answers, not distance. Just before dusk, the woman from the neighboring site approached again. Her face looked worse, colorless, drawn, like she hadn't eaten or slept. She kept glancing into the woods. "Do you want to sit by my fire for a bit?" she asked quietly. I don't want to be alone right now." I agreed, partly out of compassion, partly because I didn't want to be alone either. We sat beside her fire as the light thinned. She introduced herself as Marissa, a travel nurse from Rhode Island, camping alone between contracts. She'd arrived 2 nights before me, meaning the thing that visited us had been around longer than I'd realized. Around the time the sun fully dipped behind the trees, she told me something that made my entire body tense. "The noises started the first night," she said. "But last night, before it walked around my tent, it whispered something." I turned sharply. "What did it say?" She shook her head, eyes trembling. "I don't know, but it said it twice, and the second time it sounded closer, like it was crouching right at the zipper." A cold pulse shot down my spine. We heard the forest shift around us. Not a sound exactly, but a change in the air pressure, the same quiet distortion I'd felt the night before. We both froze. Then a twig snapped somewhere just beyond the reach of firelight. Marissa grabbed my arm. "It's too early," she whispered. "It didn't come until after midnight before." The forest answered with another snap. Closer. I stood slowly, turning toward the trail. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, through the thickening dark, something moved. Just a shape, low to the ground, gliding between tree trunks with unnatural smoothness. Not walking, gliding. My heart hammered. My throat tightened. Then it stopped just inside the shadows, a faint outline. A silhouette, thin, too thin, facing us. Watching. I felt its gaze like a hand pressed against my chest. "Don't run," I whispered to Marissa, though I wasn't sure who I was really talking to. The figure shifted slightly, an almost curious tilt of the head. Then the wind changed direction, and I smelled it, the same metallic, wet bark scent from the night before. Strong now, close enough to taste. Marissa clamped her hand over her mouth to stifle a cry. The figure took one slow step toward the firelight, and that single step snapped whatever strength I had left. Instinct took over. Fight or flight, except there was no fight in me at all. "We need to go," I said urgently. "Now." We backed toward my RV, moving slowly so we wouldn't trigger a chase. The figure didn't advance, but it didn't retreat either. It just watched us leave. By the time we reached my RV door, tears were streaming silently down Marissa's cheeks. "Please don't leave me alone tonight," she whispered. I nodded instantly. Whatever was in those woods was not something either of us should face alone. We climbed into the RV and locked every door, every latch, every window. I closed the curtains, but even through them, the pines outside felt alive, alert, listening. Night dropped over the campground like a curtain. At first there was only silence, then tap, tap. But not on the windows this time, on the roof. Slow, purposeful, then sliding. Footsteps across metal. Marissa grabbed my arm so tightly, her nails dug into my skin. I didn't move, couldn't breathe. The footsteps paced above us for what felt like forever. Then a whisper, directly above my head. A whisper that sounded calm, patient. "Aren't you going to come outside?" My blood turned to ice. Marissa sobbed silently. I held her hand so she wouldn't scream. The whisper came again, lower, almost amused. "I can hear you breathing." The footsteps shifted, then stopped, then slid toward the edge of the roof. Seconds stretched into minutes, and then something pressed against the skylight, a hand, long fingers, too long, too thin. It tapped the glass twice, then curled inward, gripping the edge. My heart nearly stopped, the hand pulled downward. The skylight latch clicked. The sound of the skylight latch shifting, that tiny metallic click, cut through the darkness like a blade. Marissa gasped and slapped both hands over her mouth. My pulse spiked so hard I felt it in my teeth. That skylight was old, fiberglass with a flimsy lock I'd been meaning to replace for years. I'd never imagined it might become the only thing between us and something that didn't move like a person, didn't breathe like a person, didn't feel human at all. The fingers curled deeper under the frame, testing it. Pulling. A soft creak followed. The skylight bowed inward. I shot up instinctively, slamming my shoulder against the small cabinet beneath the roof. Pain ripped through me, but I didn't care. I reached for the broom I kept tucked behind the passenger seat and jabbed it upward with everything I had. The creature, whatever it was, reacted instantly. A sharp, wet inhale from above, a sudden recoil. The hand snapped back out of sight, but it didn't retreat far. It moved fast to the opposite side of the roof. The metal flexed under its weight, each step a dull thud vibrating through the RV walls. Then another, then another. Pacing now, agitated. Marissa clung to my arm, trembling so violently I could feel the shudders through my bones. "What do we do?" she whispered. "We wait," I said, though I wasn't sure if waiting was safer or a death sentence. Running outside was unthinkable. Staying in felt like being sealed inside a tin can with a predator circling, searching for a seam to pry open. The thing stopped moving again. Silence swallowed everything. Only our uneven breathing filled the dark. Then, with sickening slowness, something scraped across the roof, light, deliberate, like a fingernail dragging across metal. The sound was soft but carried with unmistakable meaning. It wasn't trying to open the skylight anymore. It was listening. Listening for movement. Listening for fear. The scraping continued for several long seconds before it shifted positions again, this time stopping directly above the bedroom section of the RV. Over the bunk. Over where I'd been lying the night before. A whisper seeped through the ceiling. Not words, just breath. Slow, measured, controlled. Sounding almost curious. I felt cold tears sting my eyes. Every instinct screamed, "Don't move, don't respond, don't acknowledge." But then a faint thump echoed from the campsite next to mine. Marissa's abandoned tent fluttering slightly in the shifting wind. The flap slapped against the pole with a repetitive rhythm. The creature heard it. I knew it did, because it suddenly froze. And then, without warning, it sprinted off the roof, leaping heavily onto the ground with a thud that shook the RV. Leaves burst against the side windows as it bolted toward her campsite. Marissa let out a trembling sob. No. I didn't think. I moved. I grabbed her hand and yanked her toward the driver's seat. "We're leaving. Now." Her voice cracked. What if it's right outside? I'd rather run it over than wait for it to open another skylight, I hissed, shoving the keys into the ignition. I turned the key, the engine sputtered. Once, twice, then died. No, come on. I twisted it again. The engine coughed, choked, refused to catch. Something slammed against the side of the RV. Hard. So hard the whole frame rocked. Marissa screamed. A second slam, then a third, faster, angrier, like fists pounding against metal. No, not fists. Palms, broad and flat. I hit the ignition again. The engine roared to life. "Hold on," I shouted. I slammed the accelerator. The tires spun over loose gravel before catching, shooting us forward just as another heavy blow struck the rear panel. I didn't look back. Couldn't. The only thing that mattered was the road, any direction away from that loop. Branches whipped against the sides as we tore down the narrow campground exit. The headlights caught glimpses of the forest, too many shadows, too many shapes that looked like something crouching just out of sight. My hands shook on the wheel, but I kept driving. When we reached the main road, I didn't slow. I turned toward the nearest ranger station, tires squealing. For nearly a mile, neither of us spoke. Marissa sobbed quietly, trying to stay quiet, but failing. My breathing wouldn't settle. My jaw hurt from clenching. Finally, when the station came into view, a small wooden building with a dim porch light, I let the RV roll to a stop. I threw open the door and ran inside. The ranger behind the desk, an older man with weathered skin and gray hair, looked up sharply. "Whoa, slow down. What happened?" "There's something in the campground," I gasped. Something was on our roof. It tried to break in. It chased us." His face tightened instantly, not in disbelief, in recognition. Marissa stumbled in behind me, sobbing uncontrollably. "Please, you have to help. Please." The ranger stood, motioning urgently. "Both of you inside. Lock the door." His voice carried a weight of authority I didn't question. I closed the door behind us, hands shaking. He grabbed a radio. "Maureen, it's Loop D again. Lock down the perimeter. No one goes in or out without confirmation." Static. Then a woman's voice on it. I stared at him, heart pounding. "What is happening? What's out there?" He hesitated. That same unbearable silence I'd seen earlier, the silence of someone deciding between truth and protocol. Finally, he exhaled heavily and ran a hand through his hair. "You're not the first to report something like this, or the second, or the fifth." "Then what is it?" Marissa cried. He shook his head. "We don't have a name for it. It's not a person. It's not an animal. It's something that's been seen for years, always in the same area of the park, always watching campers, always approaching after dark." He leaned closer. "No one has ever seen its face clearly, and no one who's tried to chase it ever came back." A chill shot straight through me. "We've done everything we can to contain the area," he continued. "Extra patrols, restricted trails, warnings, but people don't listen. They go where they shouldn't go. And whatever's out there," he paused, "it learns. It adjusts. It's getting bolder." Marissa sank to the floor, burying her face in her hands. I swallowed hard. "So what happens now?" The ranger studied us for a moment, our shaking bodies, tear-streaked faces, and sighed heavily. "You two are staying right here until daylight. Then we're moving you to a safe zone. After that..." He hesitated. "You leave the park, immediately." I nodded, numb, exhausted, hollow. But then something hit me, a memory, a detail. "Ranger," I whispered, "earlier today, there was a woman camping near us. Alone. She said she'd heard it too." He froze. "What site?" I told him. He swore under his breath and grabbed the radio. "Maureen, send a unit to Site 43. Now, we might have another one missing." My stomach plunged. Marissa's breath hitched. The ranger didn't meet our eyes. That told me everything. I don't know how long we sat there. Minutes, hours. The radio crackled with distant voices, rangers combing the area with flashlights. Each update tightened the pressure in my chest. Then, finally, found the tent, empty. Tracks leading into the woods. No sign of her. I felt the world tilt. Marissa broke down completely, and the ranger quietly placed a hand against his forehead, like a man carrying a grief older than he could speak. He turned to me slowly. "You said you heard it whisper? What exactly did it say?" I swallowed hard. "The first time, I didn't understand. Last night, it said, "Aren't you going to come outside?" And then, "I can hear you breathing." The ranger closed his eyes, like he had heard those same words before. When he opened them, his voice was barely above a whisper. The last camper who disappeared reported the same thing, word for word. A cold shiver crawled down my spine. "And you're saying no one knows what this thing is?" I asked. He didn't answer. He didn't have to, because his silence told me the truth. They weren't protecting the park from the creature. They were protecting us from the truth of what lived in it. So, settle in, dim the lights, make sure your RV doors are locked and that nothing is peering at you from the tree line. Because on this channel, No Name, we don't just tell stories, we relive the ones people wish they could forget. If you enjoy chilling tales from deep in America's campgrounds, if you've ever felt that prickle on the back of your neck while camping at night, then make sure you subscribe, drop a comment, and share your own strange encounters. Your story might be the next one featured here. Now, take a breath. The night is getting darker, and this story is just beginning. The night I heard my own heartbeat louder than the forest was the night I learned that fear doesn't always come from what you see. It often comes from realizing you're not meant to understand what's watching you. My name is Mark Halstead, 44 years old, born and raised in Ohio, and I've spent more nights in my RV than in my actual house these last few years. I camp to quiet my mind, to get away from the static of everyday life. I like empty trails, creaking trees, and the kind of silence that lets a man hear himself again. But in September 2023, on the edge of the Monongahela National Forest, I learned that silence isn't always your friend. Sometimes it's the warning you don't want to hear. I had arrived late that Friday afternoon, later than planned because the traffic past Elkins slowed to a crawl behind a wreck. By the time I pulled into the small clearing I'd found on the map, a legal dispersed site tucked about 30 minutes down a gravel road, the sun was already sinking behind the ridgeline. The sky had that coppery tint that appears right before the mountains swallow the last bit of daylight, and I remember thinking how lucky I was to have beat the night by a margin of only minutes. The clearing wasn't much, a fire ring made of old stones that's enough flat ground for my 24-foot RV, and a thick wall of trees that rose sharply behind me like a dark green fortress. But it was quiet. No other campers, no distant laughter, no generators humming. It felt like the kind of place you tell yourself you'll stay only one night, even though deep down you know the solitude is exactly what you came for. I kept telling myself that the isolation didn't bother me, but that wasn't entirely true. I'd been struggling with something I didn't talk about much, a sense that I'd grown too comfortable trusting my own instincts, even when they'd proven wrong. A few months earlier, I'd misjudged a storm in Wyoming and nearly flooded out my rig. Before that, I'd ignored a gut feeling about a strange man camped near me in Arizona until he wandered into my camp at 2 a.m, drunk and confused. Nothing came of either situation, but both left a mark. So this trip wasn't just another getaway. It was me proving to myself that I could still read a place, still feel when something was off, that I hadn't lost whatever inner compass had always guided me through remote places. It didn't take long before that compass started to wobble. It started with a smell. Not a strong one at first, just an intermittent whiff of something faintly metallic like wet iron. I chalked it up to the damp earth like the way leaves rot in the understory when the nights start turning colder. But every few minutes, when the breeze shifted, it drifted through again, thicker, heavier, carrying a kind of sweetness that didn't belong in the mountain air. I convinced myself it was nothing, a dead squirrel maybe, hidden somewhere behind the tree line, a fallen branch scraping against another when the wind pushed through. Normal forest things. Ordinary things. But ordinary things don't make your shoulders tense. I finished unpacking, ate a simple meal, locked the RV, and climbed inside as the forest turned black. With no moon yet and no other campers within miles, the darkness outside pressed right up against the windows like it wanted in. I tried reading. I tried listening to a podcast. But something about the quiet outside felt wrong. Too absolute, too smothered. Monongahela is usually loud at night. Owls, insects, wind moving down the slopes. That night, everything felt held, like the woods were waiting. When the first sound came, it wasn't dramatic, more like a soft, deliberate crunch in the leaves somewhere behind my RV. I froze. Another crunch, slow, measured, as if whatever made it was testing the ground before committing its weight. A deer, I told myself. Elk, maybe even a bear. This forest was full of them, nothing to worry about. But I'd camped around wildlife all my life, and something about those steps didn't sit right. Deer move with lightness. Bears shuffle. Elk announce themselves with broken sticks and heavy strides. This sound was careful. I turned off the inside lights and stood by the small side window, peering into the tree line. Nothing, just a black wall of branches and needles. The forest swallowed the beam of my flashlight when I flicked it on, scattering it across trunks and underbrush without revealing anything. But the smell, that cold, sweet, metallic smell, drifted in again, and this time it was stronger. I stepped back from the window, not because I saw something, but because I felt watched. The hairs on my arms rose, and that instinct I'd been doubting for months suddenly came back online, sharper than I'd felt in years. Something was out there. I locked the door, even though it was already locked. The footsteps didn't return, but the forest didn't relax either. It was like every leaf, every branch, every inch of darkness had leaned closer, listening. I didn't sleep. I must have drifted off around midnight because the next thing I remember was waking to a different kind of sound, a slow rhythmic tapping against metal. Tap, tap, tap. At first, I thought it was a pine cone dropping from a branch onto the roof, but pine cones don't fall in perfect, evenly spaced intervals, and they don't pause and then start again. Tap, tap, tap. This time, lower, against the side of the RV. I sat up, my heart thudding so hard it felt like it shook the mattress. I held my breath. The tapping stopped. Silence pressed against the walls so tightly it felt like the whole forest was holding in a breath with me. Then something brushed the back window. Just a whisper of movement, but unmistakable. Something dragged lightly across the glass, like fingertips or claws or something textured enough to scrape. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. There were no other campers, no maintenance workers, no pranksters, no reason, none, for anything to be touching my RV in the middle of the night. And I wasn't parked near low branches. Nothing should have been able to reach that window. That's when the realization hit me with a force that felt like ice dumped down my spine. The sound wasn't random. It was searching. I stayed completely still, afraid even the shift of the mattress would give away my position. My breath came shallow and fast, and the air inside the RV felt suddenly hot, thick, suffocating. Something moved outside again, slowly, along the back wall, each step careful, deliberate, and then the metallic smell poured in again, stronger than ever, as if whatever carried it was now inches from the window. I clamped my hand over my mouth to keep from making a sound. I don't know how long it lingered there. Seconds, minutes, I couldn't tell. Time didn't feel real, only fear did. And that fear wasn't explosive or hysterical. It was quiet, focused, the kind that makes your mind sharpen in ways you didn't know it could, the kind that whispers, stay still, stay silent, stay alive. Eventually, so slowly I thought I was imagining it, the smell drifted away. The steps faded, the forest loosened again, the tension slowly unwinding like a held breath finally released. But I didn't relax, because the last thing I heard before the woods went silent again was the faint crack of a branch snapping directly in the tree line. Only this time it wasn't behind me, it was in front. As if whatever had circled the RV was now standing in the only clearing between me and the road out. I pressed my back against the RV door, trying to keep my body from trembling. My fingers dug into the edge of the seat cushion as I listened, straining to pick out even the smallest hint of movement. The forest had shifted again. The wind carried the same cold, metallic scent, but now it was mixed with something else: damp earth, decay, and a subtle, almost imperceptible undertone of something alive that didn't belong. I told myself it was a deer, maybe a bear, maybe a raccoon, something normal. But the mind has a way of knowing better, even when your rational thoughts are screaming for calm. Every instinct I had, years of camping alone in mountains, deserts, and forests, screamed that I was being stalked, not chased, stalked, watched, measured, and possibly studied for some unknown reason I couldn't yet comprehend. I considered driving out, but the gravel road was 20 minutes back, and the forest wasn't just outside, it pressed against me from all directions. If I moved now, whatever was out there would know. I thought of shining my flashlight into the trees, but I didn't. Flashlights give away more than they reveal, and I had the very real sense that whatever was out there didn't want to be revealed. So I stayed. I sat there, holding my breath as the darkness held me hostage. Minutes crawled into what felt like hours. The occasional rustle of leaves, the snap of small branches, the distant call of an owl. Everything seemed amplified, sharpened into an almost unbearable tension. My own heartbeat seemed deafening now, a drum in the quiet forest. And then came the sound that made me realize that this wasn't just about fear anymore. It was about presence, a low, wet scrape along the gravel outside. Slow, dragging, not a footstep, not an animal. Something scraping across the ground, following a path, deliberate and unnerving. My stomach knotted. I knew where it was, front of the RV, between me and the road. I could imagine its shape, though I didn't want to. Limbs stretched, low, something human enough to deceive the mind, but wrong in subtle ways. Too long, too precise, too patient. I wanted to call someone, but the cell signal was non-existent. My radio was useless. All I had was myself, my instincts, and the faint glow of the dashboard lights. I told myself to breathe, but even that was a risk. Every exhale could give me away. Every movement could be a signal. The scraping stopped. Silence. The forest seemed to hold its breath, and then a whisper. Not human, not words, but a soft, almost deliberate rustling that mimicked the sound of someone breathing just at the edge of comprehension. It wasn't close enough to identify, but it was close enough to make the blood in my veins turn cold. I thought of the stories I had read, the warnings passed down by locals about Monongahela's hidden dangers, hunters who vanish, hikers' stories that never make the papers, strange tracks that appear and disappear overnight. None of it had prepared me for this. None of it. I remembered an old piece of advice from my father, a man who had spent decades guiding hunters and campers. When the forest speaks, listen. Not with your ears, with your gut. My gut had spoken hours ago. Now my ears were paying attention too. Every sound, every subtle shift in the darkness, every change in the wind's direction became a language I barely understood but desperately tried to decode. Then, without warning, a branch snapped closer to the RV, almost violently, as if whatever had been circling decided to test the perimeter. My stomach turned over. I realized with a sickening clarity that it wasn't circling anymore. It had stopped, waiting, watching, and I had a direct line to it now, just across the narrow clearing, hidden in the tree line. I debated my options. Drive, too risky. Stay inside, already proven dangerous. Confront? No. There was no way to confront something I couldn't see. So I did what felt both cowardly and sane. I hid. Not physically. There was nowhere to hide, but mentally. I slowed my breathing, stilled my body, and tried to blend into the hum of the RV. I convinced myself that if I didn't exist, it couldn't find me. Time became elastic. I wasn't counting minutes anymore. I was counting shifts in the wind, the faintest cracks of branches, the subtlest changes in smell. Every one of these details was an indicator, a lifeline. And then came the sound I had feared the most, footsteps approaching the side of the RV. Slow, uneven, careful. Not a human gait, not quite an animal, but with rhythm, intention, presence, something testing its own weight, its own patience. I froze. My mind raced. Logic fought instinct. My father's words echoed again. Fear isn't your enemy. Ignorance is. I didn't know what this was. I didn't know what it wanted. But I did know this. If I acted recklessly, I wouldn't live to tell the story. The footsteps paused at the exact midpoint of the RV. Whatever was there seemed to sense me, but not fully. Maybe curiosity, maybe hunger, maybe just observation. I don't know. I never will. Then, just as suddenly as it had come, the presence receded. Steps moved backward into the darkness. The metallic smell lingered a moment longer, then was gone. The wind shifted again. Silence reclaimed the clearing. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Not for a long time. I simply waited. Every instinct told me it could return. Every shadow suggested it had never left. When dawn finally broke, pale and hesitant, I stepped outside. The clearing looked the same. The trees stood like sentinels. The forest looked normal, peaceful, empty. I checked the ground. No tracks. Nothing disturbed beyond the normal scattering of leaves and pine needles. I drove away as fast as the gravel allowed without looking back. I didn't stop at the next town. I didn't tell anyone until months later, when the story had sunk into memory but not fear. I've returned to Monongahela since then, but never to that site. I've learned to respect the invisible rules of the forest, to understand that not every danger is visible, not every fear has a shape. Sometimes the thing that hunts you is patience itself, cloaked in the quiet, watching until the perfect moment to test you. I think about that night often, about the metallic smell, the precise scraping, the presence just beyond comprehension. And I realize that fear isn't always about survival. Sometimes it's about acknowledgement, understanding that the world contains things we will never fully see, never fully understand. And the measure of a person isn't that they escape these things, it's that they listen, they observe, and they learn. That night, I learned all of those lessons. Slowly, quietly, terrifyingly. And while I can't explain what I encountered, I can tell you this. I left Monongahela alive, not because I was brave, not because I was lucky, but because I knew fear intimately, and I listened. I never imagined that a simple weekend getaway would leave me questioning the very edges of my perception. My name is Marcus, I'm 37, and I've spent the better part of a decade chasing the quiet solace of the open road, the kind of solitude that only a Volkswagen camper can provide when parked on the shoulders of America's backroads. It was April of 2020, and the Blue Ridge Parkway in Virginia had called to me like a siren through the haze of early spring. I had grown tired of the usual campgrounds, the safe, manicured plots where the echo of other campers never strayed beyond polite conversation. I wanted the raw, unshaped edges of the parkway, the overlook points where the wind feels almost tactile, pressing against your chest and rattling your nerves in a way that reminds you of how small you really are. The drive up the parkway had been unusually quiet. A soft fog clung to the ridges, diffusing the fading sunlight into muted golds and grays. My camper, old but reliable, with a faint smell of oil and pine lingering inside, coasted along the curves like an extension of my own pulse. Somewhere between mile markers 120 and 125, I spotted a small turnout, its gravel lot mostly empty, except for a single truck parked near the edge. I pulled in, hoping for the rare stillness that the parkway offered when most tourists were tucked safely in their planned stops. I set up the campsite with my usual routine, opening the back hatch to let the breeze stir the curtains, brewing a small pot of coffee that smelled of warmth and ritual. There was a faint hum, the kind that seems to vibrate through your chest when the wind catches the ridges just right. I dismissed it at first, attributing it to the old suspension of my van. The forest around the overlook was thick, trees stretching like blackened fingers toward the dimming sky. The air smelled damp, earthy, with a trace of pine sap that was almost too sharp, almost biting. I thought I was prepared for everything. The isolation, the wildlife, the quiet whispers of my own imagination, but I wasn't prepared for what would happen next. I had just stepped out to take a look at the horizon when I noticed it, a pinprick of light, faint but unnerving, hovering near the tree line. At first, I thought it was a camper down the slope, perhaps a lantern swinging with the rhythm of someone walking. but the placement made no sense. It didn't move the way a person does. It drifted in slow arcs, almost hovering, like it was assessing its surroundings rather than following a path. I froze, instinctively holding my breath. The light was a perfect orb, stark against the deepening gray, completely silent. There was no crackle of electricity, no hum of machinery, just a presence, lingering with an unsettling patience. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a reflection, a trick of the mist and low sun. Maybe someone was experimenting with a drone. But no, I had watched enough of the parkway in these quiet hours to know the drones didn't behave like this. They had patterns, predictable arcs, buzzing whines, something mechanical that gave away their origin. This orb had none of that. It moved fluidly, deliberately, almost aware of me. The hairs on the back of my neck pricked, an instinctual alarm I had learned not to ignore in these solitary moments. I went back to the camper to grab my binoculars. My hands were trembling more than I expected, the kind of tremor that seems to grow from your stomach rather than your fingers. Through the lenses, I could see it more clearly. 2 orbs, not one, moving in a synchronized dance just above the forest canopy. They glimmered faintly, reflecting the dying light, but there was no sound, no pattern of blinking, just smooth, silent motion. I tried speaking out loud to remind myself that I was rational, that this was Virginia, not some storybook nightmare, but my own voice felt hollow in the thickening fog. As the minutes stretched, the feeling of unease became heavier. It wasn't fear in the jump and run sense, it was more subtle, a creeping awareness that I was not alone in a way I couldn't measure. I remembered something a friend had told me once: the forest doesn't always speak to you with words. Sometimes it speaks with patience, and that's worse. I understood what he meant now. The orbs hovered with an almost sentient calm, as if studying me, gauging the limits of my attention. I debated leaving, debating whether I should just pack up and drive down to the next town. But there was a stubborn part of me, the part that had driven hours through empty highways for the sake of solitude, that wanted to see what would happen if I stayed. Maybe I would look back someday and laugh, chalk it up to a trick of the fading day. But standing there, binoculars glued to my eyes, I could feel the tension accumulating. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves became amplified, charged with suspicion. My mind began cataloging possibilities: campers with flashlights, drones, wildlife, but the orbs remained impossibly still, deliberate and unexplainable. Hours passed, or maybe it was minutes, time warped in that fog. I had moved to the edge of the overlook, trying to keep the orbs in view while allowing some space between myself and the van. The wind picked up, carrying with it a damp cold that seeped into my clothes and under my skin. The smell of wet soil and decomposing leaves was overpowering, grounding me yet disorienting me at the same time. I noticed that shadows seemed sharper here, deeper, moving in ways the light shouldn't permit. And still, the orbs drifted, silent, their presence almost accusatory, as if the forest itself had claimed me as an interloper. Then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, they shifted. Not erratically, not in a panic, but with a smooth, deliberate glide toward the edge of the ridge. My heart thumped, not in the panic of immediate danger, but in that slow, sickly rhythm that tells you your mind is on high alert, balancing on the edge of fear. I felt exposed, ridiculous even, but I couldn't look away. And then a second sound, or maybe vibration, I couldn't tell, tingled in my chest. It was subtle, almost inaudible, like the forest itself exhaling, as if acknowledging my presence, acknowledging that I had noticed something I wasn't meant to. Instinct told me to retreat, to step back into the camper, to lock the doors and pretend I had imagined it all. But some stubborn corner of my mind, the part that had chased the parkway for years in search of quiet revelations, urged me to stay. So I did. I watched as the orbs moved closer to the tree line below, drifting over mossy rocks and twisted roots, still silent, still deliberate. It was the kind of sight that lingers, a subtle horror that doesn't scream but burrows under your skin, a psychological weight that you can't shake. When they finally vanished into the mist, It wasn't with a rush or a blink. They simply weren't there, as if gravity itself had decided to swallow them whole. The wind shifted again, carrying a sharper, more tactile chill that pressed against my lungs, and I realized I had been holding my breath for what felt like hours. My hands were ice cold, and my mind was racing, cataloging every possible explanation. But deep down, I knew there was no easy answer. The forest, the overlook, the orbs, they had left me with the unsettling certainty that even in places I thought I understood, there were elements beyond perception, beyond reason. I didn't sleep that night, not in the camper, not with the heater running and coffee cooling beside me. I kept peering through the windshield, scanning the ridges and treetops for a flicker, a movement, anything that might indicate they had returned. I forced myself to remember practicalities, the layout of the terrain, the time, the absence of other vehicles, but the rationalizations felt hollow. The forest around me, once a place of comfort and peace, had become an emotional antagonist, pressing against my senses, distorting the familiar into something alien. By the first light of dawn, I packed up silently, refusing to glance back. Every sound, the rustle of leaves, the creak of my van's hinges, even my own footsteps felt amplified, suspicious, like the forest itself was aware I was leaving. On the descent down the parkway, I kept checking the mirrors and ridges for movement, expecting the orbs to reappear, to glide alongside the van like shadows in a silent ballet. But the morning brought no confirmation, no closure, only the uneasy memory of a presence that defied logic, a reminder that solitude has edges sharp enough to cut deeper than any tangible threat. Even now, when I recount the story, my chest tightens at the thought of those lights moving without sound. I can still feel the cold of the wind against my ribs, the damp smell of the mist, and the weight of unseen observation pressing from the shadows. The lesson wasn't in fear itself, but in awareness. The kind of awareness that respects limits, that knows the forest isn't just a collection of trees and trails, but a living, breathing entity that watches as much as it shelters. I learned to trust instinct over explanation, patience over reaction, and to understand that sometimes the most terrifying moments are not the ones that scream, but the ones that hover quietly, deliberately in the spaces between certainty and perception. I always thought of camping as freedom. The hum of the engine winding down at the end of a long drive, the smell of pine needles pressing into the air, the quiet satisfaction of setting up my small personal kingdom on wheels. That November in 2019, I parked my RV in the Daniel Boone National Forest, Kentucky, a place I'd been drawn to for its thick canopy and winding trails, convinced I'd find solitude and clarity. My name's Marcus, I'm 34, and I'd been traveling the country in my Volkswagen camper for the better part of 2 years. The forest seemed endless that evening, trees stretched tall and rigid, their bare branches clawing the gray sky like brittle fingers. There was a cold edge to the air, a kind of sharpness that made the skin on my arms prickle, despite the hoodie I pulled tight around me. Setting up the rig took longer than usual. I was meticulous about leveling it, securing the stabilizers, and making sure everything was tucked away properly. By the time I'd finished, the sun had dipped low and shadows gathered between the trunks, thick and unnerving. I told myself it was just late autumn, just the forest settling into the long night, just the wind teasing branches against one another. Dinner was simple. Canned chili heated over the small propane stove in the kitchenette. The kettle hissed as I poured hot water over my instant coffee, and I could feel the tension in my shoulders begin to loosen. The forest had an easy silence, the kind that feels safe until it doesn't. And that's when I heard it, at first subtle, a faint crunching of gravel maybe 50 feet away. I froze, spoon midair, listening. It wasn't the sound of a deer or a raccoon foraging. It had a rhythm, deliberate, almost cautious. I tried to convince myself it was just another camper, or perhaps one of the rangers checking the grounds, but the forest was mostly empty, and I was alone at this particular clearing. The wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of wet soil and pine sap, but with it, a metallic tang that made the back of my throat dry. I stood and peered through the small window next to the door. The darkness outside was dense, a black so complete it swallowed shapes whole. The gravel crackle came again, closer this time. I could almost swear it was circling the RV. My mind raced, running through every logical explanation. Maybe it was a neighbor returning from a hike, their flashlight dimmed by thick trees, maybe a stray dog. Rationalizations that felt flimsy the moment I voiced them to myself. I double-checked the locks, windows secured, curtains drawn tight. My heartbeat was steady, but the space around it seemed to grow heavier. Then came another sound, a deliberate knock, light, precise on the side panel of my camper. My stomach flipped. The knock repeated, 3 soft, calculated raps. Not the casual thump of someone bumping into a tree, not the careless sound of a falling branch. This was someone testing boundaries, someone probing. I backed away from the door and moved toward the kitchenette, telling myself I should call the ranger station. But then the noise stopped. Silence returned, thicker than before, pressing against my ears, making my own heartbeat feel like a drum in a cave. I could hear the kettle sputtering now, overboiling, but it felt louder than it should, distorted by adrenaline and fear. Minutes passed, maybe 20, maybe 5. Time seemed broken, stretched, and elastic. Then I heard it again. Gravel. Slow, measured, dragging steps that traced the perimeter of my campsite. Footsteps that were too heavy to be a child, too deliberate to be a wild animal. My hands were trembling now. I wanted to peer outside again, to confront whatever was out there, but something told me to stay, to watch, to let the fear sharpen my senses. I sat back down, gripping the edge of the table, listening. Each sound, the scrape of leaves, the subtle creak of a branch, the whisper of air through the pines, felt like it carried intention. I couldn't see anything, yet I felt eyes. I knew I wasn't being watched by a deer, a raccoon, or any ordinary creature. There was intelligence here, calculated patience. I thought back to every story I'd heard around campfires, the ones the locals whispered when they thought newcomers weren't listening, people disappearing, RVs broken into, late-night prowlers who left nothing behind but fear. I'd always dismissed them as exaggerations, the kind of folklore that made rustic camping feel dangerous in an exciting way. But now, with each echoing footstep on gravel, I realized that fear has its own clarity. It teaches you things logic cannot. I tried to distract myself, reminding myself that the forest was vast, that I wasn't cornered, that anyone approaching would have to reveal themselves eventually. I pulled my phone from the pocket of my hoodie, but service was patchy, almost non-existent. The screen lit up like a small candle in the dark, yet it offered little comfort. The forest outside seemed to press closer in response, shadows pooling in corners, and for the first time I questioned my decision to camp alone in a place this isolated. Hours, or what felt like hours, passed. I stayed awake, listening, each noise setting off a cascade of scenarios in my mind. Every shifting leaf became a warning, every snapping twig a herald of intrusion. And then came a sound I will never forget. Slow, shuffling footsteps directly beneath the rig. My stomach clenched. Whoever or whatever was outside had stopped moving, waiting, listening. I could feel it in the vibration through the ground. Not a predator. This was human. Intentional. Focused. My rational mind screamed at me to call for help, but something primitive held me in place, a need to observe, to understand, to confront without inviting attention. I tiptoed to the window, peering through the blinds. Darkness stretched endlessly, no light, no movement, and yet the sound of those footsteps persisted, just outside the edge of the RV. The forest was alive with them, breathing with a malevolent patience that made my skin crawl. I grabbed a small flashlight, planning to swing it outside, just to see, just to confirm I wasn't losing my mind. But as I flicked the switch, the beam landed on a patch of disturbed gravel. The footsteps had stopped. A shadow, faint but there, slid across the perimeter, melting into the night. My pulse raced, my thoughts fractured. Was it someone watching me from behind a tree? Or had I imagined it, my mind betraying me under isolation and darkness? Sleep was impossible. Every creak of the rig, every gust of wind set off waves of panic I could not contain. I stayed awake, listening, and I realized something. The forest doesn't hurry. It waits, it watches, it teaches patience in ways the world outside never could. And whatever was out there, it had patience too. I stayed huddled in the VW camper, tracing every noise, memorizing the subtle patterns, learning the forest's rhythm. Every movement outside, every whisper of sound became a test of resolve. And as the hours dragged on, I knew something fundamental. Fear isn't just a reaction. It's a teacher. I didn't know then what or who was circling my rig, but I knew one thing with perfect clarity. I had underestimated the quiet menace that lives in the gaps between trees, in the spaces where light fails to reach, and in the ears of those who listen too closely to the wrong kind of night. Morning came, though it was reluctant, filtering through the thick canopy in pale, hesitant streaks. The forest seemed quieter than usual, almost holding its breath. I hadn't slept a wink. My eyes were raw, my muscles stiff from crouching over the small table, every sense stretched taut, waiting for something that might never come. The night had left marks on me I couldn't quite name, shadows embedded in my vision, phantom crunches echoing in my ears, and the lingering metallic scent that clung to the air inside the VW like a stubborn ghost. I tried to convince myself it had been imagination, the exhaustion of isolation playing tricks on my mind. Yet when I stepped outside to assess the site in daylight, the gravel told a different story. Disturbed patches, footsteps circling the rig in ways that made no sense, depressions in the soil that hadn't been there before. Someone had been here, around my camper, while I lay awake, paralyzed by fear. My stomach churned, but there was a grim clarity in that morning light. I wasn't imagining it. I had been watched. The first impulse was to leave immediately, to pack up and flee. But the forest has a way of ensnaring you, even when the path back to the road seems clear. The winding trails with the dense undergrowth, the sheer remoteness of the clearing, it all slowed me. And the realization that someone had gotten this close without my knowing made me hesitate. I had to know. I had to see. I spent the day circling the perimeter, flashlight in hand, though the sun offered little comfort. There were broken twigs, patches of scraped bark, faint impressions in the mud, almost like someone crouched or crawled to stay low. I couldn't shake the feeling of being evaluated, of someone learning the contours of my campsite, my routines, my very vulnerabilities. Night returned faster than I expected. The sun dipped again, and the cold crept in, sharper now, gnawing through the layers I had so carefully chosen. I locked the RV and sat in the dim light of the small interior lamp, listening. Every sound, the snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, the faint scuff of gravel, set my nerves alight. And then it started again. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Closer this time, circling with a precision that was impossible to ignore. I tried to rationalize. Maybe it was a hiker, lost, curious, harmless, but something about the rhythm, the pauses, the way the gravel shifted without breaking into a random pattern told me otherwise. This was someone practicing, testing me, probing. My mind refused to stop running, chasing every possible scenario, yet refusing to settle on any answer. And then came the whisper. At first, I thought it was the wind, curling through the trees, bending around the corners of my rig in strange teasing ways. But the sound repeated, a breath, soft, deliberate, almost human. I pressed my ear to the wall of the camper, heart hammering, listening. It was close, too close. The whisper became a pattern, brushing along the edge of consciousness, making me doubt my own senses. It wasn't a voice, not exactly, but it was intentional, present, aware of me. I thought about making a call, going out to confront whoever, or whatever, was out there. My hands shook as I dialed, then hung up before it even rang. The fear wasn't just external, it was inside me now, lodged in my chest, a physical weight. Every instinct told me to flee, yet my mind argued stubbornly for observation. To understand, to survive by knowing my adversary. Hours passed. The steps circled, shifted, vanished, only to return in a new pattern. The whispering sound moved, curling around the edges of the rig, teasing the boundaries of reality. I could feel the presence, but I could not see it. And then, suddenly, a flashlight beam swept across the perimeter. Just for a second, but long enough. A narrow line of white cutting through the trees, casting branches like jagged fingers over the ground. I ducked instinctively. The beam passed, vanished, leaving nothing but darkness and my own panicked breaths. I realized then that I had underestimated how unnerving fear can be. It's not the threat itself that terrifies, it's the uncertainty, the knowledge that someone else is out there, moving through your space, unseen, waiting and aware that you are aware. The psychological weight is heavier than any physical danger, and it presses in, distorting the forest, turning ordinary sounds into something sinister, something designed to unnerve. Hours became more minutes than measured time, the RV turning into both sanctuary and prison. I could feel the anticipation in my muscles, the hyper-awareness of every crack in the floor, every vibration through the wheels. My mind oscillated between denial and panic, between rationality and imagination. Each creak became a sentence, each shadow a character in a story written in the dark by an unknown author. Then it happened. The first real confrontation. A branch snapped too close, and I jumped, my flashlight swinging wildly. In that brief flash, I saw him, someone crouched at the edge of the tree line, backlit by the faint glimmer of the moon above. It wasn't a ghost, or an animal, or a trick of light. It was human, watching, waiting. The moment stretched, my heart pounding in my throat, every muscle frozen in the primal urge to flee or fight. And then he moved, fluidly, silently, melting back into darkness before I could blink. I realized that the forest wasn't just my antagonist. It was his ally. Shadows, trees, uneven ground, the curvature of the clearing, all of it masked him. And yet, even in the briefest glimpse, the intent was clear. This was someone who understood fear, who used it, who thrived on the knowledge that I knew he was there but couldn't reach him. I spent the rest of the night in a heightened state, every sense sharpened, every sound amplified. The footsteps returned intermittently, the whispering brushing against the RV walls, and the memory of his figure lingered in my mind, a ghost that wasn't gone. Sleep was impossible. Every attempt to rest was interrupted by the anticipation of movement, by the dread of the unknown. By the time dawn arrived again, the air was thick with fog, the kind that clings to the skin and makes the forest feel unreal. I knew I had to leave. Staying was no longer a choice. Packing up was deliberate, careful, every motion measured to avoid drawing attention. And as I pulled the VW onto the gravel road, I cast a glance into the tree line, half expecting to see him, half expecting nothing at all. The forest seemed empty, silent, indifferent. But I knew better. Even after I had driven miles, even after the hum of the engine and the open road offered a semblance of normalcy, I could feel him, just at the edge of perception, a shadow in the corner of my mind. That forest, that night, had changed me. Not because of any physical injury, but because I had been touched by something primal, something that thrives in silence, in isolation, in the space where fear is allowed to grow unchallenged. I learned a few lessons that November. Trust your instincts, respect the isolation, never assume you are alone, and understand that fear isn't just a reaction. It's a teacher. And sometimes the lesson is brutal, delivered in whispers, footsteps, and the cold, patient observation of someone who knows you are there but doesn't need to be seen. Even now, when I think back, I can hear it, the crunch of gravel, slow, deliberate, encircling, teaching me in its own terrifying way that the forest is alive, and sometimes so are the watchers within it. I never thought a simple trip to Cumberland Gap would leave me questioning the very air I breathed, the sounds I heard, and the shadows I thought I knew. My name's Marcus. I'm 34, and I've been RV camping across the country for nearly a decade. I've faced storms that made my rig shudder, wildlife that stared me down with patient hunger, and strangers whose intentions were as clear as mud. But nothing, prepared me for that August night in 2022, the night I first saw the shadow standing by the dump station. I arrived at the RV site just as the sun was bleeding out behind the ridges, painting everything in a restless orange that felt almost alive. The campground itself was quiet, too quiet, except for the faint hum of insects and the occasional groan of the old wooden kiosks scattered near the entrance. There were maybe a dozen rigs here, spaced far enough apart to feel like isolation, close enough that I knew I wasn't completely alone. My own rig, a modest Class C, settled into its slot with the faint crunch of gravel under the tires. I remember pausing, listening to the whisper of leaves in the heat-stilled evening, feeling the way the forest pressed inward like it wanted to swallow the parking area whole. After unhooking the RV and setting up, I decided to take a quick walk. Just a few minutes, I told myself, stretch my legs, check the dump station, which was tucked near the far edge of the lot. The air smelled of damp earth and pine sap, the scent somehow heavier than normal, almost clinging to me. As I approached, I noticed a figure leaning near the edge of the metal station, motionless. At first, I thought it was a fellow camper, maybe someone closing up for the night, but something about the way they stood, too still, too deliberate, made the air thicken around me. I called out, "Evening, everything okay?" My voice felt too loud, too foreign in the oppressive quiet. The figure didn't respond, didn't move. I squinted through the shadows, trying to make out features, but the fading sunlight and the thickening canopy above distorted everything. All I saw was the outline of a man, tall, shoulders hunched as if burdened by some invisible weight, and his head tilted slightly downward. I should have felt relief when I realized the person wasn't advancing, but instead an inexplicable unease took root. I circled the dump station, making a slow, careful pass as though my cautious steps could somehow measure the danger. The shadow didn't move, didn't flinch. The more I watched, the more my mind filled in details I couldn't be sure were real. An arm twitching, the faint glint of something reflective, a posture too precise, too intentional. I shook my head, telling myself it was just my imagination, that the stress of driving all day and the oppressive humidity were making me paranoid. But then I noticed the first subtle hint that I wasn't just being paranoid. The gravel near the shadow had an indentation, like a boot pressed hard against the ground, the kind of mark someone makes when they've been standing for a long, long time. And the way the shadow seemed almost to lean toward me, just slightly, almost imperceptibly, made my chest tighten. My instincts screamed to retreat, but a part of me needed to see, to confirm that my fear was unfounded. I told myself, logically, that if it was a person, there would be a reason for their behavior. Maybe someone had arrived early, maybe they were waiting for a friend, maybe they were harmless. But I couldn't shake the creeping sensation that I was being sized up, examined without consent. Every nerve in my body bristled. The wind stirred the trees and the shadows shifted across the forest floor, but the figure stayed unnervingly constant. Deciding that ignoring it was safer than confrontation, I backed toward my RV, keeping my gaze low, yet aware of every subtle motion from the dump station. That's when I first noticed the sound, a soft, scraping noise, faint but unmistakable. It didn't come from the forest. It didn't come from the gravel. It came from the direction of the figure, as if someone or something was dragging the edge of a foot along the ground in deliberate, methodical increments. My pulse jumped, yet I couldn't tear my eyes away. By the time I reached the threshold of my RV door, the sun had disappeared entirely, leaving only a bruised violet sky and the creeping darkness beneath the trees. I slipped inside, locked the door, and sat for a long time listening. The sound didn't stop. It was intermittent now, punctuated by long stretches of silence that somehow made the noise even more unnerving when it returned. I pressed my forehead to the cool window and watched the dim outline of the dump station. The shadow was gone, or at least I thought it was. Sleep didn't come easy. Every small creak of my RV, every whisper of wind across the aluminum roof set my heart racing. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it had been a camper exploring the site, maybe it had moved off into the trees, but deep down, a part of me knew that the unease wouldn't lift. That night, I realized that fear wasn't always loud, wasn't always accompanied by a scream or a chase. Sometimes it was quiet and patient and impossibly meticulous. Morning brought little relief. The campsite was bright, sun glinting off metal surfaces, birdsong trying desperately to fill the void. I ventured outside, scanning the gravel around the dump station, half expecting to see footprints or marks, something concrete. There were faint impressions, yes, but irregular, scattered, like someone had wandered aimlessly, then deliberately erased their path. I looked around, half expecting a fellow camper to appear, waving apologetically, but the area was empty. No one, no sign of life except for the whispering trees and the occasional glimmer of wildlife. I tried to shake the memory, packed my cooler, planned a hike to distract myself, but the memory of the still, unblinking presence lingered. Every step along the trails that day was colored by it. The way shadows pooled beneath trees, the way sunlight fractured across rocks and moss, all seemed to carry a subtle, menacing pattern that my mind couldn't ignore. I realized I was watching, expecting the shadow to appear at any turn, to step from behind a tree or linger near a trail junction, just to remind me I wasn't as alone as I thought. By the time evening rolled in again, I approached the RV with a renewed sense of caution. I tried to tell myself I was imagining things, that the fear had no footing in reality, but instinct refused to be silenced. I moved quietly, deliberately, taking a circuitous route around the dump station to reach my rig. And then I saw it again. This time, closer, not leaning, not ambiguous, just standing, watching. The shadow didn't wave, didn't gesture. It didn't need to. Its presence alone was a weight that pressed down, a darkness that seemed to suck in light. I froze, chest tight, ears straining for any sound, any human sign, but there was nothing, no rustle of clothing, no scuff of shoes, no voice. Just a figure, immovable, deliberate. I realized then that fear could be both simple and complex. Simple in the way my body wanted to flee. Complex in the way my mind began to fill in details, height, stance, possible intent, imagined threats, all spinning in a web that I couldn't disentangle. And in that web, I understood the depth of my own vulnerability. Alone, with only my rig between me and the unknown, I felt the precariousness of my trust in the world. I decided to act. Slowly, carefully, I reached for my keys and my flashlight, keeping my gaze low but aware. The figure didn't move. I edged along, heart hammering, every instinct screaming that one wrong motion could be disastrous. And yet I kept moving, step by deliberate step, until I reached the threshold of safety, or what I perceived as safety, inside my RV. I slammed the door, double-locked it, and sank to the floor. My hands trembled uncontrollably. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time lost its shape. The fear didn't leave. It transformed into a constant vigilance, a quiet dread that permeated every corner of the RV. I realized, in a way I hadn't before, that some dangers aren't external. They are suspended in the tension between observation and inaction, in the waiting, in the not knowing. And I also realized that night that Cumberland Gap, with all its beauty and history, could feel hostile, oppressive, alive. I stayed awake until dawn, staring at the door, listening to the subtle shifts of the forest. When the first light filtered through the trees, I stepped outside cautiously. No shadow, no figure, just the normal sounds of a campsite waking up, of birds, of distant traffic along a ridge. But the imprint it left on me was permanent, the memory of a presence that didn't need to act to be threatening, the realization that fear could exist in observation alone, in anticipation, in the patient wait of someone or something, simply being. I tried to convince myself to enjoy the day, to push the memory of that figure to the back of my mind, but every movement felt measured, every shadow suspicious. I went for a walk down a narrow trail leading from the campground, hoping the fresh air and dappled sunlight would wash away the tension coiled tight inside me. The forest seemed ordinary at first, bright greens, the smell of damp earth, the chirping of cicadas. But the deeper I went, the more the environment felt off. Leaves rustled overhead in a way that made me glance upward, expecting to see a branch sway, a bird take flight, but there was nothing. The wind shifted suddenly, brushing my neck with an almost deliberate chill. I tried to breathe calmly, telling myself that I was overthinking, that my nerves were frayed from a long drive and a sleepless night. And yet, every time a twig snapped behind me, every time the underbrush seemed to tremble with the passage of some unseen creature, my pulse spiked, my senses tightening like a drawn bowstring. I came upon a small clearing where the sun pierced through the canopy in narrow beams. Normally, this would feel peaceful. Normally, I would pause to take in the beauty, maybe snap a picture, but instead, I felt watched. I turned slowly, scanning the tree line, the gravel path that led back to the campground, the shadowed corners of the clearing, my eyes straining to catch a hint of movement, a silhouette, anything that would explain the heavy sense of scrutiny pressing down on me. There was nothing, yet the feeling didn't dissipate. It intensified. I realized I was holding my breath. My body had adopted a kind of rigid alertness. I didn't notice until a sudden exhale released a tension I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying. And in that brief moment of release, I swore I caught a movement at the edge of my vision, a dark figure slipping behind a tree, a shadow melting into shadow. My stomach clenched, nausea twisting through me. I shook my head, cursed under my breath. My rational mind told me it was a trick of light, a play of shadow and leaf. My instincts, however, screamed otherwise. I turned back toward the RV, walking briskly, every step deliberate, scanning for any sign of the figure near the dump station, near the trails, anywhere in the periphery of the campground. As I approached, I noticed again the same quiet stillness that had unsettled me the night before. The campground was alive with morning activity, campers emerging from their rigs, kids running along the paths, but the dump station remained empty. Or so I thought. And then I saw it. A shadow, subtle but unmistakable, standing just beyond the edge of the metal enclosure. Not moving, not leaning, just there, observing, or perhaps waiting. I froze mid-step. My hands tensed into fists at my sides, fingernails digging into palms I didn't realize were clammy. I considered calling out, letting someone else break the tension, but my voice felt like it had been stolen, replaced by a tight, silent dread. I tried to reason, to rationalize. Maybe it was a camper I hadn't noticed, maybe someone unloading late, maybe even a ranger doing maintenance. But the impossibility of relaxation grew with each passing second I spent staring. There was no motion, no indication of activity beyond the mere presence, the deliberate placement of a human, or something human-shaped within the clearing. I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes locked on the shadow. My mind ran through scenarios, contingency plans, escape routes, even bizarre if-then scenarios I would normally laugh off in the safety of my home. Every instinct screamed that retreat was urgent. And yet, as I moved backward, the shadow seemed to respond, not with motion, but with a subtle shift in perception, an almost imperceptible change in stance that conveyed patience and intent. Returning to my RV, I felt my skin crawl. Each step toward the rig was punctuated by the faint sound of my boots on gravel, my own breathing too loud, too revealing. I reached the safety of my threshold, slammed the door, and leaned against it, letting the cool metal press against my chest, grounding me. I couldn't sit still. I paced back and forth, flashlight in hand, scanning every corner, listening to every sound the campground emitted. Hours passed. Shadows lengthened, the sun dipping behind the ridges again, and the forest once more seemed to exhale its weight over the site. I tried to eat, tried to drink, tried to convince myself to rest, but sleep was impossible. Every small noise, every flicker of movement in the dark corners of the lot made me flinch. I realized that the dread wasn't just fear of a physical threat. It was the anticipation, the knowledge that someone or something was aware of me, studying me, waiting. That night, I resolved to stay awake, armed not with courage, but with awareness. I sat at the window, flashlight across my lap, observing. Minutes felt like hours, hours blurred into some kind of distorted perception of time. And then, in the dead stretch of midnight, I heard it. A soft scrape, deliberate and controlled, echoing from the direction of the dump station. My heart skipped, then raced. I swallowed, trying to remain calm, though I knew calmness was a luxury I no longer possessed. Slowly, I raised the flashlight and swept the beam toward the source. The shadow didn't flee. It didn't move aggressively. It simply stood, absorbing the light, yet refusing to reflect or break. And in that moment, I understood what made this encounter different from anything I'd ever faced. The figure was patient. It didn't need to attack. It existed, and its existence alone was a force, pressing into my mind, contorting rationality, planting unease deep into my chest. I remembered a lesson from my past travels, a principle of survival I rarely needed to exercise with such intensity. Acknowledgement, not confrontation, often preserves life. I didn't call out. I didn't move. I simply observed, holding my breath, counting the seconds, measuring the faintest cues of sound and motion, and trying to convince myself that the figure would eventually leave. It did not. Hours passed. I drifted into moments of near sleep, only to jolt awake at imagined movements. The sun eventually began its slow climb, teasing light through the trees, and I forced myself to move, to make breakfast, to reclaim some semblance of normalcy. When I ventured outside, the shadow had vanished. The campground hummed with morning life, kids laughing, RVs pulling out, the dump station empty and innocuous. Yet the imprint remained, a gnawing psychological echo that I couldn't shake. That day, I stayed vigilant, exploring nearby trails and interacting cautiously with other campers. The forest, which had once seemed a comforting companion, now felt like a maze of hidden scrutiny. Every tree, every underbrush clump, every seemingly ordinary movement in the distance was subject to suspicion. I realized fear could exist without confrontation, without physical threat. It could exist purely in the knowledge of observation, in the slow realization that you were being studied without consent. Even after I packed and left Cumberland Gap, the feeling lingered. Each time I parked at a new campground, each time I walked to a dump station or a secluded trail, I carried the memory of that patient, deliberate shadow. And I understood something critical. Fear isn't always about what you can see or touch. Sometimes it's about what waits quietly, imperceptibly, outside the boundary of immediate perception. Sometimes it's about your mind, stretched thin by anticipation, made fragile by a presence that refuses to announce itself fully. That encounter changed the way I approach camping. I don't assume benign intent anymore. I don't trust the quiet. I carry awareness as a tangible tool, a shield against the invisible, the unspoken. And though I can laugh now in the safety of home about the irrationalities and the tension, I know that the memory of that shadow, the patient, unblinking watcher by the dump station, will always exist as a measure of how quickly control can slip from the mind when faced with quiet, deliberate observation. Even now, months later, I can close my eyes and hear the scrape of gravel, feel the heat of August pressing through a Tennessee forest, and sense that weight again. Not threatening in the traditional sense, not violent, but unbearably precise. It taught me that the most profound fear isn't necessarily fear of being hurt. It's fear of being truly seen, evaluated, known, and left waiting. And that shadow, it wasn't just a figure in the campground. It was a lesson, one I'll never forget. I had just parked my old Volkswagen Westphalia at the edge of the Nantahala National Forest, the tires sinking slightly into the soft, damp earth when the first sense of unease settled over me. The sun was low, spilling golden streaks through the thick canopy, casting long shadows that danced across the forest floor like silent, shifting figures. My name is Marcus, I'm 34, and I've spent more nights on the road than in any house over the past decade. This trip was supposed to be a quiet escape, me, my VW, and the woods. But as soon as I stepped out of the van, I felt it. The forest watching, its breath heavy and humid against my skin, pressing in, subtle but insistent. I'd picked this particular clearing because it seemed secluded yet safe. A small stream gurgled nearby and birds trilled in the distance, but there was something unnatural about the way the forest seemed to fold around me. the trees leaning slightly closer than they should. I shrugged it off. You always notice things when you're alone. Still, the moment my feet hit the dirt, the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. Setting up camp was uneventful at first. I rolled out the awning, checked the propane, and started a small fire in the ring near the van. I listened to the sounds of the forest as I unpacked, the rustle of leaves, the occasional snap of a branch, and the whisper of the stream. But then came the faint scratching. At first, I thought it was the wind playing tricks, maybe a branch brushing the side of the van. Then it came again, deliberate and soft, almost like fingernails dragging lightly over wood. My stomach tightened and I froze, straining to hear. There was no one else around, just me, and the sound coming from directly under the van. I crouched and peered under the chassis, the shadows deeper than they had any right to be. Nothing moved, nothing at all. But the sound persisted, now accompanied by a low, almost imperceptible thumping, like something heavy being dragged across the dirt. I could feel my pulse in my temples. It made no sense. What could possibly be under a VW this far from any road, deep in the forest? Rationality screamed at me. Raccoon, a possum, something small, nothing that could hurt me. But something in the way the noises shifted, like it was aware of me, set my nerves on edge. By nightfall, I forced myself to focus on practicalities. I lit the campfire fully, stacked logs around the edges of the van for light, and tried to ignore the persistent feeling of being watched. Shadows in the firelight seemed to move differently than they should, reaching toward the van like tentative fingers. I told myself I was imagining things, that solitude does strange things to your mind, but the instinct in the pit of my stomach refused to let go. The scratching had stopped, but now there was a soft, dragging sound every few minutes. I tried to pinpoint it, but every time I thought I knew where it was coming from, it shifted, always just beyond clear view. Sleep was a distant idea. I kept the fire alive, the orange glow painting the interior of the van in unsettling, flickering shapes. Around midnight, a low, wet sniffing sound began, close enough to make me stiffen. My hands went instinctively to the baseball bat I always kept under the driver's seat. The sound circled the van, slow, deliberate, stopping and starting as if testing my reaction. My mind raced through every possibility, each one worse than the last. I imagined a wild animal trapped under the vehicle, maybe wounded, maybe cornered, but the rhythm of the sounds didn't match any animal I'd ever known. There was intelligence behind it, a patience that unnerved me more than any attack could. I sat frozen for what felt like hours, listening to the intermittent thumps and scratches. My fire burned low, casting long shadows across the dirt and trees, shapes that my tired eyes could not distinguish from reality. I debated calling for help, but then rational thought pushed me back. Cell service was spotty here, probably non-existent. Anyone coming this way would take hours at best. I was alone, and the forest had claimed that fact entirely. Eventually, the noise subsided, leaving only the soft hum of the stream and the occasional rustle of leaves. My body relaxed slightly, enough to crawl into the van and lock the doors. Lying on my sleeping pad, staring at the roof, I tried to convince myself that nothing had actually happened. The rational part of me told stories of small animals or the wind, but the unease lingered, a shadow pressing against my mind. I could still feel it, just beyond the walls of the van, waiting. Morning brought light but not relief. I opened the door to a forest bathed in mist, the air damp and cold against my face. Everything looked innocuous, almost peaceful, but the earth beneath the van bore subtle signs, small scuffed paw marks, scratches not consistent with any known animal I could identify. My heart sank. Whatever had been under my VW the night before had left evidence of its presence. I tried to rationalize. Maybe a raccoon with unusually long claws, maybe a stray dog, but deep down I knew it had been something else, something patient and observing. As I packed up, I noticed another detail. The ground under the van was cooler than the surrounding dirt, as if some creature had lain there long enough to draw the warmth out of the earth. I shivered and shook my head. The rational side of me dismissed it. The other side, the one that had been awake all night listening to scratching and sniffing, refused to let go. I learned then that fear doesn't always announce itself with teeth or claws. Sometimes it's a whisper, a brush against the edge of your senses, and by the time you notice, it has already rooted itself in your mind. The drive out of the forest was quiet, almost too quiet. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something crouched in the trees, watching me retreat. Nothing appeared, but the feeling of eyes on me persisted. I couldn't shake it. And even now, months later, I can recall that first night in exquisite detail. The way the shadows moved, the intermittent thumps under the van, the smell of damp earth, mixed with something else, something faintly metallic, lingering in the air. I never camped in that part of the Nantahala National Forest again, not out of superstition, but because the forest had shown me something that night. That solitude is a double-edged sword, offering freedom but also exposing you to the subtle, intelligent disturbances that thrive in shadows. I learned to trust my instincts more deeply, to question rational explanations when my gut screams otherwise, and to respect the quiet patience of the wild. Fear, I realized, is not always sudden or violent. Sometimes it is patient, waiting beneath your vehicle, watching, knowing you are alone. Even now, when I close my eyes and let my mind drift back to that night, the memory feels tangible, almost touchable. The way the forest seemed to breathe around the van, the cool dampness clinging to my skin, pressing in through the thin walls. I remember leaving the edge of the clearing the next morning, the forest still silent but somehow more oppressive in daylight, as though it had been waiting for me to leave before resuming its patient watch. A few months later, I returned to the Nantahala area, drawn by the compulsion that sometimes accompanies fear, the need to understand it, to face it on my own terms. This time, I camped a little further down the same winding gravel road, where the trees formed a tight tunnel overhead, sunlight struggling to touch the forest floor. The VW rattled slightly as I parked, the engine settling with a low hum. My hands shook as I laid out the sleeping pad, the firewood, and the few supplies I brought. It was the same ritual, the same motions, but the tension was different, thicker, more personal, a memory stitched into the fibers of the clearing itself. By nightfall, the familiar sensation returned, the subtle awareness of being observed. I told myself I was overreacting, that my imagination had woven a story from minor noises the first time, but the forest had a way of teaching you humility. That first night back, I heard a low, dragging noise almost immediately after sundown, coming from beneath the VW. My pulse spiked, and for a second, I froze entirely. Rational explanations failed to arrive. It wasn't consistent with any animal I'd ever known, and there was no wind. The sound moved, slow and deliberate, pausing, then starting again. It circled once, twice, as if measuring me. I gripped the bat and crouched low, my knuckles white. The fire cast long, flickering shadows across the clearing, but the van remained the focal point of the subtle disturbance. I remember staring at the tires, fighting the imagination, the outlines of something crouched there, something patient, calculating. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to leave, but part of me, the part that had always pushed the limits of fear, wanted to stay, to observe, to understand. Hours passed, or maybe minutes, time bending in the presence of acute fear, and then came the faintest shift of movement beneath the vehicle. A scraping, dragging sound, soft but distinct, like claws on metal. My stomach twisted. My mind raced through every rational possibility. Raccoons, stray dogs, a hiker's prank, but none fit. The forest itself seemed to tighten, closing in around the van. Each branch, each rustling leaf felt charged with intent. I realized then that fear is rarely about what you see. It's about what you feel pressing against your awareness, shaping perception, twisting ordinary details into something sinister. I stayed awake that night, sitting on the edge of the van's open door, bat in hand, ears straining for every sound. The forest was alive in a way that was almost sentient. Every gust of wind seemed calculated, every distant animal call precisely timed. And beneath it all, that dragging, scraping, patient presence circling the van, testing boundaries. I could hear it pause, sniff the air, shift, retreat slightly, only to return moments later. My own heartbeat became an anchor and a torment, echoing in my ears louder than the forest itself. Morning light brought no comfort. When I climbed out, the forest looked deceptively calm, mist rising from the undergrowth like ethereal smoke, light glinting off dew-soaked leaves. But the ground beneath the van told the story more clearly than my eyes ever could. Small scuff marks, faint but deliberate, lined the dirt, accompanied by tiny, shallow impressions that seemed almost human in proportion, though distorted. I knelt, running my fingers over them, heart sinking further. I wanted to believe in mundane explanations, small wildlife, shadows of imagination, but my instincts screamed that I had encountered something far less explainable. I made a note to myself then: fear is not always immediate. Sometimes it is a slow accumulation of unease, a pressure that creeps into the mind and lingers, waiting for cracks to appear in rational thought. That night, the forest had taught me that lesson once more. A week later, I decided to push the experiment further. I parked in a different clearing, where the trees were older, denser, and the stream ran closer, the water louder and more insistent. I told myself this was about confronting my fear, about understanding the forest's quiet menace. But as night fell, I realized something else entirely. It was not the fear of being hurt that gripped me. It was the fear of being watched, of being understood and measured in a way that went beyond physical threat. The first sign came from the tires. A soft, deliberate tapping, almost like fingernails on metal. My pulse jumped, muscles coiling. I crouched, peering into the shadows beneath the van. Nothing moved, but the sound persisted, a rhythm in sync with my own nervous heartbeat. I felt the weight of the forest pressing down, humid air thick against my skin, every branch and leaf a potential conspirator. I tried to read the environment, to predict the sound, but it defied logic. Every time I thought I could pinpoint its source, it shifted, impossible to trap with reason. And then the scent came. Damp earth, decayed leaves, and something else, faintly metallic, almost coppery. My stomach lurched. I realized I was breathing shallowly, counting each inhale to maintain a semblance of control. Hours blurred. I kept the fire alive, but the shadows it cast seemed to multiply, stretching and bending in unnatural ways. The forest was no longer a collection of trees and underbrush. It was an organism, observing me, responding to my movements. Every snap of a twig, every whisper of wind became part of a larger narrative, and the sound beneath the van punctuated it, patient and deliberate, like punctuation in a sentence I could not read. By midnight, the sense of surveillance had escalated into a suffocating presence. I could no longer ignore the fact that the noises were intelligent. Something under the van was assessing me, perhaps waiting for the precise moment to make its move, or perhaps it would never make one at all. The patience was worse than any attack. It allowed the imagination to spiral, to construct horrors that might never exist but felt as real as the cold metal beneath my hands. When the first hint of dawn brushed the treetops, I realized I hadn't slept. My body was exhausted, but my mind remained taut, alert. I had learned a crucial truth over these nights. Fear is amplified not by certainty, but by ambiguity. It thrives in the spaces between knowledge and ignorance, in the dim recesses where rational thought falters and instinct prevails. Packing up, I moved quickly, not wanting to linger, to give the forest or whatever dwelled beneath the van the chance to test me further. The marks on the ground were deeper this time, more deliberate, almost as if the entity, or animal, or whatever it was, had wanted to leave a message, a reminder of its presence. I didn't stop to study them. I left, driving away with a mixture of relief and lingering dread, the VW rattling along the gravel as though it, too, felt the forest's weight. Even now, I carry the echo of those nights with me. The dragging, scraping noises beneath the van, the low metallic scent in the damp air, the oppressive sense of being measured and observed. I understand now that some lessons are taught not with confrontation, but with subtlety. The forest didn't need to harm me. It only needed to make me aware. Fear can linger long after the immediate threat disappears, shaping perception, sharpening awareness, teaching respect for the hidden life around you. I never camped in those particular clearings again. I altered my routes, my habits, the way I approached solitude in the wilderness. But the memory remains vivid. The patient, watching presence beneath the VW, the quiet dread pressing in from every side, the knowledge that the forest can harbor things that defy expectation, that can instill fear without ever showing themselves fully. That, I realized, is the essence of fear. It is not always immediate, not always violent. Sometimes it is patient, lingering, intelligent in its subtlety. It teaches caution, humility, and respect, not through attack, but through the slow accumulation of awareness, the kind of fear that burrows beneath the skin and refuses to leave.